The next one is the Champion pacemaker. Right here, pacemaker or Sweet 16. They had to change the name because Mercury threatened to sue them if they didn't. This is a really strange engine. It's crankshaft ported. It does not idle well, but it puts out an enormous amount of horsepower for its size and weight. It's a really light engine. But this one, in the lower unit, like Mercury's Mark 28, has a spring drive for forward, neutral, reverse, except in this one, instead of the springs being in the leg, they're all in the lower unit down here. So it's a very complex, very, well, let's just say, I'd say it's rather fragile if you let it run without any oil in it, and it does take oil. And it has a handle which has a shifter that you do this with. That's the shift, that's forward, that's neutral, that's reverse. And it won't allow you to do that if the throttle is advanced too far. It will allow you to do it if the throttle is not advanced too far. It has a really complex mechanism inside of here. This engine was difficult to put together. This is one of two that I put together out of 3 engines, and it's got some real weak places. The drive shaft on this engine comes down through here, and it's got no lubrication essentially, and there's one seal underneath the water pump, and it barely covers itself, and there's no way to fill oil up into there. I modified this a little bit by putting a screw up the top of the lower unit so that you could make sure that oil was all the way up to the top. I found this engine had a lot of horsepower, very complex to use, and the setup was strange. This engine is actually shorter than all the competitors of its era, so it would go faster. And the propellers, when I tested this engine, this propeller right here, this was a Go Fast Michigan wheel, which does give it more speed, but barely, about a half a mile an hour more than the standard wheel. So they really set this thing up to go fast. I had to actually cut down my transom half an inch to get this thing to run and not cavitate. And I had to actually run with the engine tucked in further. Not a very user-friendly engine. This thing is really complex and way out of whack as far as I'm concerned compared to the rest of them. But it was an experience to work on it, and it does run. I mean, you can see it again on Pine Tree Boating Site's YouTube channel. You can see this running on a boat. The next engine is the Chris Craft Commander. This engine, when I was working on it, I had the impression that this thing was a real hot potato. It had a stuffed crankshaft. It had a lower unit which was smaller in diameter than Mercury, so it had less resistance. It had pistons which were 2-ring versus 3-ring. And I expected this engine to outperform the Mercury KG7. It came close, but it did not. It did not outperform it. I've got the Aquajet propeller on it, which I had on the Mercury KG7 as well. This engine was half a mile an hour slower. It's arguable, but I don't think it was any faster than the Mercury. But in my testing, it came out a little under the Mercury. But then I'm probably prejudiced because I'm a Mercury guy. Have been all my whole life. It's a heavy engine. It's sand cast, all the parts and pieces, which is cheap and easy to do, versus this engine right here, this this Champion pacemaker, Sweet 16. Everything is basically made with steel molds, so very, very expensive to make those molds, and very, very You have to produce a lot of them in order to make them pay, and I don't think they did make them pay on this one. I think it was shortly thereafter the company went out of business. This engine right here, Chris Craft, he was casting, so who cared, you know? You could change anything you wanted to as you went along. It's fairly weak. Most of the ones I've run into, this front piece has been broken. This one's not. Been fairly lucky. It's got a Bendix Scintilla magneto, which seems to work fairly well. The Mercury Mark 20 used the same system. Didn't work so hot for them. Again, the engine runs well, seems to start fairly well. I've had a lot of difficulty with the ignition on it, but basically it's placement of the wires. There's not much room to move anything. I have a shorting switch on all of my engines that go fast, and this one right here is difficult to get the wires to put them in there without hitting the rotor or the flywheel. The next engine here is the Scott Atwater, 16 horsepower. This is the second design cowling. The first one had this very modern looking plastic thing that was all very hot looking and kind of cool. This is the next iteration. This engine was, in my testing, was heavy. It definitely has to be readjusted between high speed and low speed. You cannot, it's not consistent. The carburetor bowl, float bowl, was too small to provide fuel at the top end. You had to set your float so it allowed more fuel to sit in that float bowl to get it to even run. I have a lot of difficulty understanding that. Fortunately, I had a fellow, Dan Chacoin, who would work with him, and he said, you gotta set that float the way it says in the book, which is high. It shifts well. It runs okay, but it's an older engine than some of the other ones here. I think it's a little bit older design, and it is heavy. This 1955 had the Bailomatic, but all the water pumps, this is the last year for having all the both water pumps down in the leg. So it's sort of an unusual model. The service manual does not tell you how to set it up. I went through 4 different service manuals, and nobody made any mention of the model, this model year. The synchronization of the throttle and the timing advance and the carburation, there's really nothing there. You have to kind of figure it out for yourself. But again, it runs and idles fairly well and runs good at the top end, but it's not a hot engine. The Evinrude right here is 15 horsepower. When I was doing this, I was testing all the 20 cubic inch from the mid-50s, and my friend Larry Carpenter said, well, Lincoln, you've got to test the Champion Sweet 16. I didn't even know it existed before he sent me up 3. And then he said, you got to test the Evinrude. I said, well, those are bigger cubic. He said, no, the 15 is 20 cubic inch. This is a 1953, 15 horsepower. This engine really surprised me. It's light, it starts and runs wonderfully well, and it's got a lot of zip. It wasn't the fastest for the full gear shift ones, but it was right up there. The covers on it are, for an Evinrude, relatively easy to take on and off. The later ones were miserable compared to this one. And the engine ran just terrific. I repainted it. The one that's in the, all 4 of these engines are in the Pine Tree Boating Club's YouTube. And you could see them all running on the boat. But this one, like I say, this was my real pleasant surprise. I'm not too fond of Evinrudes, and this one was a real winner. As far as I was concerned, it's probably one of the better engines in that size category I've ever run across. And it's a nice running motor. Idles well, starts easy, and just runs great. No complaints. And let's see what else we got on here. Once a year. A50. Okay, we got one more here to do, and this is the A50, 4 horsepower Johnson. This one's right here. They started making this in 1930 through 32. It's the little brother to this K50, which was the first of the alternate firing twins, and they came out with both of these the same year, 1930, which would have been the summer of 29. These engines both run extremely well. This one has the original automatic exhaust cutout. Most of them were replaced with a plate, and they put this thing on the back. It was a kit. I've still got a couple kicking around. You put this on, and you put a plate over the side, which you can barely see there. And this one's still got the original one. I left it on there. It still works, and I thought it was kind of interesting to leave it. This engine right here performs very, very well. It's on, again, on a video on the Pine Tree Boating Club's YouTube channel. It's a fairly old video. You have to go back to, I guess it's a Songo, or a memorial run we took a couple of years ago. But you can see it going and beating some of the other participants in that race.
Really?
David Kelly.
Is that on the Cadance River?
Cadance River, right. Cadance River was the Russ
Dyer.
Russ, yeah.
Russ Dyer Memorial.
Russ Dyer Memorial, right, run, and that was 2 years ago. You can see it on there. You gotta go back in the files a little bit. The lower units in both of these, even though they're different size, they run very, very well. I do believe they both had slip clutches for the propellers. It's internal. It's a spring-driven cone type of arrangement, and this seems to work fairly well. This one's got the stock propeller. This K50 has a racing propeller on it, and those are very good propellers. Extremely well. Okay.